I start with this short introduction? I think everybody has this as an attachment, so you've had a chance to read through it. And so I'm not going to read it all from the paper, but just to point out perhaps the very interesting journey you've had, Jimmy, from starting off as an advocate of the Supreme Court in South Africa. My goodness, no wonder your work is so legally neatly done with lots of footnotes and so on. So then becoming involved in NLP, which is now, I would say, from what you've told us, is your main work. But in addition, moving into leadership and performance management, all of those areas which I think some people here are also involved in. But also to let those know who perhaps haven't got this at hand, Jimmy has honors degree in philosophy, postgraduate diploma in management, and spirituality masters from St. Augustine's, philosophy masters from St. Augustine's, and soon, maybe soonish, PhD from St. Augustine's in philosophy. And interestingly here, I didn't realize that you're also a member of the South African Medico-Legal Association, medical and legal. So that must be very interesting. I'd love to hear about that. Just a quick 15-minute presentation before your paper. But that sounds very interesting. But I also love this last sentence because this is the Jimmy I know for some years now, Jimmy, I guess, going back to those classes at St. Augustine's and then all the study. So the last sentence here, in his training, consulting and counseling work, Jimmy brings a high level of insight, integrity and compassion, and is known for his respectful commitment to assisting people in the fulfillment of their noblest dreams. And I think that's wonderful. And some of us I know would love to attend some of your NLP teaching. I've been saying this for about 10 years and I haven't done it yet, but I'd love to go. Maybe that's another possibility for another time. But assisting people in the fulfillment of their noblest dreams. And may I add something that you didn't put here, a wonderful lover of dogs, a great lover of dogs, a great carer of dogs, many of whom may have difficulties in adapting, and I'll leave you to perhaps elaborate on that if you wish, Jimmy. But in terms of the presentation today, we're delighted to know that you're going to give a quick summary of your PhD research and basically asking the question, does contemplation disclose genuine insight? The rest of the title is there if you've got it in front of you. So I don't need to read that out. But does contemplation disclose genuine insight? And I think obviously linked to neuroscience, which I think we're all most interested in. So Jimmy, welcome, and thank you so much for offering this, willing to come on. And we did check with you. You don't mind us sending the recording to other people who can't be here?
I don't.
You're okay with that?
And if you share it with me, I will also forward it to people that I know who'd be interested.
Yes, because I tell you, just as a matter of sort of the admin of the group, what happens now, we thought we'll just meet once a month. Once every 2 weeks is getting a little bit too much. We do have a number of speakers. And as you said, EJ, there'll be lots of speakers who will be willing to come. But we decided to go back to our monthly meetings. And the address lists for Mystic Matters and Sadiba are very large. And they have to be set up in different chunks because Google will not allow a large group at this stage anyway. There's some new regulation. So what we do when EJ records this, I will then send it out to the whole group, the two groups, with the details of our next meeting. So it'll be a little bit, 2-3 weeks from now. But for those who would like the recording earlier, for example, Suzette, we'd be very happy for you to have it as well. Do let us know. And once we've got it from EJ, we can distribute it in the meantime. Okay.
Thank you, Celia. To start, just to clarify a potential misunderstanding, initially I was given the choice to talk about Neuro Linguistic Programming, NLP, which is this wonderful model of communication and coaching and counseling, or to share research at its current stage. And obviously my PhD was influenced by my background in NLP because it has been very powerful in shaping my personal life and my career. But this particular presentation, while it is somewhat informed by NLP, is not really going to talk about NLP in any detail. But please, if you do have questions, we will have a Q&A at the end of the presentation, and there's always the chat facility as well. So while this is a rather academic research proposal, I will try and make my presentation as user-friendly and understandable as possible, with a start of appreciation to my two supervisors, Professor Curie, our own Celia Curie, and Dr. Kyriacou Kruger. I had very much wanted to do something which combined philosophy and mysticism, and I'm very pleased that this was possible in a manner of speaking. So let's just put the context of the project in place. Cognitive neuroscience is the scientific study of what happens in our brains when we perceive and think, reason, will, and act. And it's really exploded, especially in the last 20 or 30 years, because we now have the most amazing neural imaging technologies, which literally allows to, as it were, peer inside a person's brain when they perform various tasks. And given that, it was only a question of time before the same tools and techniques began to be applied to the study of contemplation. What happens in the brain when somebody is praying or meditating? And this gave rise only quite recently, in the last perhaps 20 years, initially to a field called neurotheology, which eventually gave rise to a broader field called contemplative studies generally, and contemplative neuroscience specifically. So I will have a bit more to say about contemplative studies as a new field of studies like spirituality, but a strong part of that is focused on the neuroscience specifically. Now, this interesting graphic of an armchair going up in flames explains that there's a third element to this research project, a new movement in philosophy called experimental philosophy. Now, most people, when they think about philosophy, think about a bearded gentleman, usually elderly and smoking a pipe, sitting in an armchair and contemplating the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. But that has not always been the case, and certainly more recently, a group of young philosophers in search of new methods and new approaches have asked the question, what would happen if we began to use methods from experimental psychology to answer philosophical questions? And it's quite a controversial movement, partly because some people don't agree that it is philosophy at all, but also because experimental philosophy has upended a number of assumptions and ideas in philosophy. In particular, the use of intuition in philosophical argument. And we can go into this in a bit more detail, but there's a sense in which experimental philosophy is rather critical of intuition, philosophical intuition in particular. And the reason for this is the suspicion that many so-called intuitive approaches to philosophy are both culturally relative and gender relative and race relative, and the experimental philosophers are doing surveys and questionnaires and experiments to try and get to the bottom of what might be going on. So on the one hand, experimental philosophy can be thought of as a criticism of contemplation, but there's another sense in which, in advocating experimental methods, it could be thought of as complementary to contemplative studies, because contemplation is an interdisciplinary field of study, just like spirituality, and experimental approaches can be thought of as part of that as well. So just to say a little bit more about spirituality, here I mean the academic study of spirituality. Obviously, spirituality is ancient, archetypally ancient, but as a field of study, spirituality has been relatively recent. And so, because spirituality is an interdisciplinary field of study, it has both benefited from and been challenged by new approaches in the sciences and in philosophy. And we can see from the bottom right-hand corner that there's this traditional, well, not so traditional, but it's become traditional to distinguish between spirituality and religion, with many people claiming that they are spiritual but not religious. Obviously, the ideal would be something in between. So this raises the question, what is the relationship between philosophy, spirituality, and contemplative neuroscience? Are they mutual? Are they complementary? And a useful approach here would be in my next slide. And this is a very traditional understanding of the relationship between science and theology that is due mainly to St. Thomas Aquinas, who in his own way was a great mystic, but also a great philosopher and a theologian. And he liked to talk about the idea that God spoke to us through two books and not just one. The first book is the book of Scripture, and it is susceptible and requires human interpretation and gives us theology when it's approached systematically. But the second book, according to Aquinas, was the book of nature. And this too must be understood hermeneutically through human interpretation, and it gives us the sciences. And so the question that this raises, and it's a really vast topic, is what is the relationship between these two great books? Does either one predominate over the other? Or, as Aquinas himself believed, that any apparent contradiction between the two was a misunderstanding? Um, so this also highlights a cautionary note. You see here a picture of Albert Einstein together with Father Georges Lemaitre, a French-Belgian priest who was also a scientist, an astrophysicist. And Father Lemaitre gave rise to the Big Bang Theory. He didn't call it that, but he was the originator of the idea. And while Einstein initially was opposed to the concept, he was finally persuaded that Georges Lemaitre was right. Now, what happened then is very soon after the Big Bang Theory was accepted, Pope Pius made a statement and he claimed that this was proof and scientific validation of the Catholic faith, proof of the existence of God, and he cited the work of Father Demetrios, who very quickly wrote a letter to the Pope sounding a caution. And it's a caution I think that is very important to bear in mind. He said, as far as I can see, such a theory remains entirely outside any metaphysical or religious question. It leaves the materialist free to deny any transcendental being. For the believer, it removes any attempt at familiarity with God. It is consonant with Isaiah speaking of the hidden God, hidden even in the beginning of the universe. Implicit in his statement was the idea that it was opportunism to latch onto the latest scientific theories and to say, see, this proves our favorite theory of theology, religion, and spirituality. And while this was in the 1950s, unfortunately, we see this mistake being repeated in so-called quantum spiritualities, which are making the same mistake of relying on scientific evidence to bolster religious or spiritual beliefs. And maybe in the Q&A section, we can go into this a little bit more to look at why is this a problem? Why should we be very suspicious of trying to use science to bolster a spiritual or theological position? So what are the reasons then for looking at the interface between philosophy, science, and spirituality? Spirituality is important to all of us, and the assurance that contemplation is somehow a means of taking us closer to an ultimate truth is an issue that has been debated for centuries and is potentially of enormous benefit to all of us. Sorry, there's a temporary freezing that happens when I admit somebody into the meeting. Here we go. It also has implications for wider society because interspirituality is a tremendous unifying force in a world of religious intolerance and conflict. So it's wonderful to have the opportunity to look at spirituality across the board, understand it from its original spiritual sense, but also to look at how science can offer some validation of some of the claims. And it's relevant also to philosophy because one of the key branches of philosophy is this idea of epistemology, or how do we know what we know? And mystical insight in particular raises this fascinating question: how much can we rely on the teachings of the mystics? So here is a quote from one of my favorite authors. It's now time to examine the epistemic validity of mystical experience and the cluster of problems associated with it. Such questions as the following emerge. Are mystical experiences purely subjective, or do they have some kind of objective validity that the mystics and others claim for them? In other words, is the mystical experience veridical? Does it offer truth? And therefore, does it provide insight, notice the word there, insight into the nature of God or ultimate reality, however conceived? On the other hand, since the mystical experience is embedded in culture, in human construction, and we saw this earlier when talking about the experimental philosophical approach, highlighting the role of culture and gender in how we interpret various phenomena. So does this mean if mystical experience is embedded in culture, that any claims that the mystics make are to be taken as just relative claims? The famous philosopher Bertrand Russell in 1921 acknowledged that mysticism can be a source of inspiration, and yet he denied that it could yield any kind of truth. Similarly, another author, Katz, stated unequivocally that it's not possible to verify mystical experience. But he went on to say, if by verification we mean that independent grounds for the claimed experience can be publicly demonstrated. He went on to say, it also seems correct to argue that no truth claim can be generated on the basis of mystical experience. So the consequence of that, according to Katz and Russell and others, is that mystical experience cannot be the grounds for any final claims about the nature of truth, nor for any specific dogmatic or theological belief. So this is a challenge to mystical teachings, to mystical insight, to the view that mystical experience somehow brings us closer to an ultimate reality. And according to this view, the idea that mysticism can be a type of gaze into ultimate reality would be unacceptable. And this was a quote from Professor Curie. Now, not all mystics would accept the skeptical position, obviously, but there is a further challenge. And the further challenge is that almost all of the mystics, certainly more than half, will claim that ultimate reality, which is experienced in contemplation, nevertheless cannot be expressed in words. And so there's this paradox of somehow being in touch with an ultimate reality and yet insisting that words fail in trying to explain it. Now, philosophically, there's a standard analysis of truth or knowledge rather as justified true belief. I'll just mention it in passing. That if knowledge has to be justified true and a belief, then mystical insight would seem to be excluded from that account. Katz, and, this is one of the number of titles that he edited. In the light of Katz's skepticism nearly 40 years ago, perhaps the time is ripe for revisiting his groundbreaking mysticism and philosophical analysis, but now with new tools, the tools of neuroscience, philosophy, and spirituality. So that's really what I'm hoping to do in my own research. It has the potential to bring some measure of resolution to the debate and to shed a little bit of light on the issues highlighted by Professor Curie and the other authors mentioned. All right. So here's just a brief summary. The aims of the study: to review the latest findings in contemplative studies, experimental philosophy, and spirituality with a view to answering questions concerning the epistemic validity of contemplative insights. Now, the questions that this raises, and this will be of interest for our conversation today: what do we mean by contemplation? What do we mean by insight? So here you can see that in the center, we have insight, and there are these three pillars, as it were, these three approaches to the question: contemplative neuroscience, spirituality, and experimental philosophy. So here are the subsidiary questions. What is contemplation? What is insight? What is the relation between contemplation and insight? Are they the same? Are they different? Is insight the result of contemplation? Is it the other way around? What kind of data is available, and what counts as data that could answer this question? Historically, how has this question been considered? All the way back to Aristotle, the concept of different kinds of intellects. And for Aristotle, the idea that there was a different form of intellect that was in touch with the spiritual realities has a long tradition, which only in the last few hundred years came into question. But contemplative science is suggesting perhaps we can revisit the question. So here's a richer formulation of the question. This is due to my co-supervisor, Dr. Kruger. He asked, could recent developments in contemplative neuroscience, experimental philosophy, and spirituality provide concrete suggestions and support for an argument that favors a broader understanding of knowledge, one that once again takes contemplation as a part of knowledge? So this is telling us that certainly in the last 200 to 300 years, contemplation in philosophy and in science has gone out of favor, but has been sustained and maintained by mystical studies and spirituality. But maybe there's scope for some kind of a rapprochement. I say that I'm not aware that this particular focus has been brought to the issue, and the fields of contemplative studies, experimental philosophy, and spirituality have resources to address the question, but the application to the issue of insight may have been somewhat overlooked since the work of Katz and others. In particular, I said that I have not come across any research that ties experimental philosophy to contemplative studies or spirituality, although I would suggest that there is room for a fruitful dialogue. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip past some of this because I really want to share with you the actual neuroscience, which is fascinating and very interesting. So here's an example of the kind of things that I am wanting to find more of. Saint Anselm is famous for providing a so-called proof of the existence of God, one that many philosophers, even atheist philosophers, have thought is very interesting and not entirely easy to reject. And St. Anselm writes that he battled for a long time to try to come up with some sort of a formula that would simply rely on the use of reason and yet be a kind of justification for the existence of God. Now, I'm less interested in the so-called proof, but please notice this last paragraph. Just after he had given up on the project, this is very important. It wasn't while he was grappling with the problem, it was just after he had given up on the project. There's a clue there. The idea came to him in a flash of insight, and that disclosed the famous proof for the existence of God that he proceeded to outline. So the two things to take away from this slide, first of all, this idea of taking a break or pausing or even giving up, and then the sudden flash of insight that, as it were, came out of the blue and was completely surprising and unexpected. All right. So here we have these two beautiful creatures in a state of contemplation. What is contemplation? Well, the Merriam-Webster dictionary says that there are a number of possible definitions. One is a concentration on spiritual things as a form of private devotion. So perhaps a type of prayer, contemplative prayer as we've come to know it more recently. But it can also be a state of mystical awareness of God's presence and of God's being. This is more in line with Bernard McGinn's understanding. Contemplation can also be an act of considering with attention. For example, when we say the studying made a decision after much contemplation. So here, instead of it being a state of awareness, it's more a process of reasoning and thinking. And then there's another definition, perhaps similar to the very first one, the act of regarding steadily. For example, when we say that these two creatures were lost in quiet contemplation of the beauty, as it were, of the ocean. And then a definition that we don't hear much of today, a type of intentional expectation, as when Sir Arthur Conan Doyle says, a considerable crime is in contemplation, or is being considered. Here's another definition from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, a form of wordless prayer in which mind and heart focus on God's greatness and goodness in effective, loving adoration. To look on Jesus and the mysteries of his life with faith and love. And I think that's a beautiful definition, although we wouldn't want to just limit it to Christian contemplation. Now, this diagram is quite fascinating because it's been developed by the Center for Contemplative Mind in Society. You can see their website at the very bottom of the page, but they regard contemplation as a tree with many branches. And so we have communion and connection, awareness, taking us into the roots. But then we have all these many branches: creation process practices, singing, charting, music, arts, movement practices, qigong, tai chi, pilgrimage, yoga, martial arts, stillness practices, silence, centering prayer, insight meditation, active practices, work and volunteering, pilgrimage, just to name a few, generative practices, loving kindness meditation, lectio divina, the Jesus prayer, ritual and cyclical practices such as the Sabbath, the revision quest, relational practices, dialogue, deep listening, storytelling. So this tells us that contemplation and contemplative studies is actually a vast discipline and is far beyond simple ideas of meditation or contemplative. There are some synonyms: deep thought, planning, meditation, reflection, reverie, ambition, cogitation, rumination, pondering. And we have to wonder that some of these appear to be at odds with each other. If we are in a state of reverie or musing, that doesn't quite seem to be entirely in line with planning or ambition. But that just tells us that the word is very broad and we have to be quite careful in how we use it. It comes from the Latin word contemplare, which means to gaze, to observe or behold. So at its heart, and this is due to Coleman, at its heart it has the sense of beholding God's presence. In centering prayer, we say, I consent to the presence of God as a way in to the practice. There's both a visionary dimension and also an embodied dimension. All right, so moving on, let us turn to mystical insights. And Horn, in his short book on mysticism and vocation, says, mystical illumination is interpreted as a central visionary experience in a psychological and behavioral process that results in the resolution of a personal or religious problem. Now, the word vision here is perhaps a little bit misleading because it doesn't always involve vision, but it is an intense form of the insight-seeking process. And we see that it goes on in activities such as solving theoretical problems or developing new inventions. And this distinction between mystical contemplation or insight as a type of surrendering to the presence or a type of insight seeking that is involved in solving problems will be quite important. So defining insight, the capacity to observe or discern the real character of things, a clear and often sudden understanding of something. So many of the definitions of insight have this idea of clear and reliable, but also sudden and unexpected. Bernard Lonergan, I like to call him the most famous philosopher you've probably never heard of, a Catholic Jesuit priest, but also an amazing philosopher. And he wrote this 600-page tome on insight. And he says that insight is a type of understanding. When we have this sudden intuitive understanding, then this is a type of insight. But he cautions that merely arriving at an insight is not sufficient for knowledge. Our answer to the question, what is it, our insight might well be correct, but it could also be incorrect. We have to subject our insight to a further scrutiny, and this will be discernment or judgment in order to ground that insight with a further insight, what he calls a reflective insight. Now, this is just from the Christian tradition. There are also many, many examples of insight in other world traditions, from Buddhism to Hinduism to Sufism. So many people have heard of Vipassana or insight meditation, the practice of continued close attention to sensation through which one ultimately sees, and here we have it again, the true nature of existence. It is believed to be the form of meditation practice taught by the Buddha himself. In Zen Buddhism, there's the concept of Kensho. Kensho is a sudden insight into the ultimate nature of things. In Hinduism, and Advaita Vedanta in particular, there's the idea of moksha. Moksha is attained by jnana, insight knowledge. And so we see that this is really a vast topic. In-depth psychology and in Freudian psychoanalysis, the patient is thought to arrive at a resolution of their, quote, neurosis and contributors problems which they may have previously repressed or suppressed. So the promise of insight on the one hand is that it can effect a realization of the reality of the divine, the beauty of the natural world, transcendence of space and time, joy and bliss, insight into the workings of the universe. But it can also be experienced in the reality of daily life. And Professor Kyriacou here points out that many people have had the most intense, even transformative mystical experiences in nature, through music, literature, and art, in childbirth, in conditions of extreme stress, in sex, under anesthetics. All of these can be triggers to mystical experience, because what they have in common is this temporary suspension of the boundaries and the grasp, as it were, of our ego mind. And when that is relaxed, there's the opportunity for these unconscious insights to pop to the surface. So this is the most interesting part that I was very keen to get to. I'm assuming, EJ, that we still okay for time. According to my reckoning, I've got another 50. That sound okay to you?
Yeah, we're still fine.
Great. All right. So this is some of the most exciting parts of the research that I have come up with. And it's in this remarkable book called The Eureka Factor, very recent book by two professors, John Cuneus and Mark Beeman. There's also another book by a psychologist, Gary Klein, who in a way takes it a little bit further, but at the very least, I want to be sure that we cover the work of Cuneus and Beeman. So we talked right at the beginning of the new forms of brain imaging. And there are two major techniques. And you will see that while the two techniques, the two forms of technology work differently, when you put them together, then you almost get two for the price of one, as it were. So the first one is called functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, and this is literally what it looks like. The dubious experience of having a CAT scan. This is like a CAT scan for the brain. So what happens is that it detects changes in the brain associated with blood flow. It used to be that you had to drink a particular chemical, wait a period of time until it got to the brain, and then this chemical would show up under the imaging. But now the tools are far more powerful. The technique basically relies on the idea that blood flow is coupled with the activity of neurons in the brain. When a certain part of the brain is being used, blood flow to that region increases, and this can be detected. So you can see on the right-hand side, the top, the hands, you see very little activity. But by the time you get to the bottom set, there's quite a lot of activity happening in this particular brain. All right, so this is a powerful tool because it provides a momentary snapshot. It's a moment by moment photograph, as it were, of what is happening in the brain at a particular split second in time. Now, there's a second very important tool, and while the fMRI is taking snapshots, slice by slice of time, an EEG gives us movement over time. We see the process over a period of time. And this is a test that is used to evaluate the electrical activity in the brain. Brain cells communicate with each other through chemical and electrical impulses. An EEG can be used to detect potential problems, but also other things happening in the brain. It relies on electrodes. So here this lady is having this hairnet, as it were, being placed over her, and every one of these little dots is a particular electrode, and the result of this recording is that it will give us a series of brain waves. Now, you may remember from a previous talk that we have 4 major types of brain waves. Beta, 14 to 30 hertz, is associated with mental activity. Alpha brain waves associated with a waking state, but resting, also commonly associated with light meditation. Theta brainwave patterns are common at the lower levels, the 4 hertz range with sleep, but at the higher levels around 7 with creativity and deep relaxation, and hypnosis. And then delta patterns, deep sleep. And you can see the different wave patterns happening there. Now, what's very important is that all 4 of these patterns are happening at the same time. But depending on whether we are highly alert or deeply asleep, one of these brainwave patterns will be predominant. The other patterns are also present at the same time, but they are not, as it were, in the driver's seat. So right now, most of us are probably somewhere in the alpha range. I might be a little bit higher in the beta because I'm wanting to be more attentive to what I'm about to say. But even in deep sleep, we have some beta and some alpha and theta happening. Now, what's really remarkable is in the last 20 years, through the neurotheological research, the contemplative neuroscience, the studies of people in meditation and in prayer, we've discovered a fifth brain, and gamma brainwave patterns are way up here above beta, and they are very rare, which is why we haven't discovered them before. We haven't been aware of them before. But with the cooperation of the Dalai Lama and many advanced meditators who have allowed themselves to be researched with EEGs and fMRIs while in a deep state of meditation, we've uncovered this fifth brainwave pattern called gamma. And now here's the punchline, the most exciting thing. Gamma brainwave patterns are associated with these moments of eureka and aha insights. So here we have John Cunius researchers. I will skip the biographical details, but eureka or aha moments are sudden realizations that expand our understanding of the world and ourselves. And we have many examples. Paul McCartney talked about how the music to one of the Beatles' most popular songs, he woke up with it and it was playing in his mind and he couldn't remember where it came from. And so he played it to the other Beatles and they'd never heard of it. And eventually he realized that it was an insight, an aha that he had come to. And all he had to do was come up with the lyrics. So Cunius and Beeman explain how insights arise, but they also look at the various conditions which assist us to have more of them. So an insight is sudden, and it has a number of levels. At the experiential level, it's experienced as a sudden and disconnected from preceding thought. It's a kind of out of the blue, where did that come from idea. At the behavioral level, there's the sudden availability of information about the correct answer to a question or puzzle. And at the neural level, we see that at the exact moment that there's an insight, there's a sudden burst of gamma band, gamma waves. Though insights come as a surprise, sometimes we can sense that an idea is present, lurking just below the threshold of awareness. Nearly everyone has had aha moments of sudden clarity. They can and do, they say, change lives. So did you know? And now here are two different kinds of insight. The first insight type is analytic. It's what happens when we solve the crossword puzzle, or when a mathematician works on a proof. And that analytic type insight is normally associated with a burst of alpha brainwaves. But these deeper insights, these aha insights, are these gamma bursts. And there's one last piece that is important to highlight, and it is the following. You will see that there are two lines on this particular slide. And these are the split seconds leading up to an aha moment, a eureka moment. And basically what happens is that in the moments just before we have this gamma burst, it's as if the brain, and I'm speaking metaphorically here, decides to shut down the visual part of the brain, the the narrative yakety yak self. There's a definite closing down of the busy part of the brain, almost as if it's a preparation for this moment of insight. So the gamma burst then explodes at that wave is dampening down. This is quite a remarkable finding, this relationship of these two brainwave patterns that, in the words of Gauguin, I shut my eyes in order to see. This is a remarkable expression. So it's the reason why, in order to enable more insights to come to the fore, we want to be still, be alone, and minimize distractions by turning down the noise and even closing our eyes, because it's this shutting down of the alpha and the beta that is more likely to contribute to that insight that comes later. So this is a very busy slide, but it's a kind of a summary of the entire work of John Kyriacou. So I think at this point, with perhaps just minutes to spare, I'm going to stop and hand over to Eugene. But I'm happy at this point to take any comments or questions.
Thanks, Jimmy.
Thanks, Eugene.
Jimmy, thank you very much for the lovely presentation. I particularly like the neuroscience. I think, as you may have hinted somewhere in your talk. Question that I have is the link or the possible link between insight and intuition. What is your understanding of the term, these two terms? Would you equate the two, or are there subtle differences still?
That is a question that I haven't fully answered to my own satisfaction. I think that there's a difference. I would say that insight is a type of intuition, but more so in the sense that insight, it's sudden and unexpected, and it almost it literally catches us by surprise. And intuition can be a lot more subtle, and while it's the same type of knowledge, or literally a seeing into, that's what the word intuition means, which is exactly the same as what insight means. Intuition tends to be this more low-key, more subtle background feeling of knowing something.
The gut feeling.
But the insight is the one that bowls us over.
Thank you for that. I'm quite interested in how one can use contemplative practices to help us in daily decision making, make us more wiser people. And I think I understand the difference that you draw between insight and intuition. And maybe there's a place for both.
Yes. There's also the paradox, Elmore, that both intuition and insight, the harder we try, the less we get. The paradox of it is that we have to let go, but we can't just abandon everything. So we contemplate and we meditate and we even think, debate, go. Intuition, as it were, percolates in the background and catches up to us later. But if you try to have an intuition, it's almost a guarantee that you won't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks,
So
Jimmy.
it is
Thank you.
paradoxical. Thank you. Celia, you look like you wanted to say something.
Yes, thanks, Jimmy. Well, firstly, thank you so much, Jimmy. The more I
And thank
listen
you
to
to you
you, the
too.
more in it. Sorry?
Thank you to you too.
Oh, yes, sure. But I just wanted to say, for those who haven't met Jimmy before, perhaps, I wanted to say he is a gem. You are a gem. Because each time I listen to these presentations, and obviously as you move on in your research, you have greater insights that we are benefiting from. I'm very grateful that you're with us and sharing all of this. But Jimmy, there's one thing I'd like to ask you, which you didn't touch on, but perhaps it's just part of the research. When you talk about, well, at some stage in our conversations, I think, rather than in the presentation, you've spoken about the neuroplasticity of the brain. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. And, what is it and how is it activated? And what are the results of, tapping into the brain in this way? Plastic, is that right?
Yes.
Yes. So thank you.
Wonderful. So this will take us into a little bit of NLP as well. So I'm delighted at the question. So what you think about is that for many years, perhaps thousands of years, hundreds of years, idea was that the brain, as we got older, became more and more used up, as it were. Okay, that we were given at birth a finite number of brain cells, and with every sip of alcohol, or every cigarette, or every bump on the head that we may have gotten on the rugby field, or what have you, we lost certain brain cells with what was thought, mistakenly as it happens, an inevitable decline the older we got. The idea of neuroplasticity turned that upside down. And neuroplasticity is basically the idea that the brain is like a muscle, and we can continue generating new brain cells well into old age on one condition, and that is that there's a reason to. In other words, staying with the idea of the brain as a muscle, there's the principle of use it or lose it. If we do not exercise our brain, then like a garden that hasn't been tended, the weeds will take over and the growth will stop. But if we make a commitment at whatever age to keep going and to keep growing and to learn new things and to take on new projects and to never accept that we are too old for anything, then the brain will reward us with new brain cells. I mean, it's literally that simple. So that's really the principle of neuroplasticity. Now, to answer the second part of your question, what we need to do to activate it is to get excited about life and about learning and about growing and discovering new things, whether it's figuring out how Zoom works, or learning a new language, or getting a master's degree, Francis. These are all ways to give the brain an excuse to create more brain cells.
Thank you so much. Just one small follow-up. Have you had examples in the field of health where intention to have a more, how can I put it, that the neuroplasticity of the brain is being activated upon by the person who is in, say, ill health, and that it has resulted in better health or something to that effect? In other words, can we, for ourselves and maybe for others, help with the ongoing development of the brain with respect to health issues?
Yes. So there's a remarkable book by Martin Doidge, D-O-I-D-G-E, and if I remember correctly, although I may be confusing it with another book, his book is called The Brain That Changes Itself. So a similar kind of theme. And so there's an example in that book of research that was done, for example, with people who have had a stroke. And often people who have had a stroke will favor the hand, for example, that is not affected. But there's this fascinating research that has shown that very early after the stroke has happened, if the patient has a regular practice, maybe twice or 3 times a day, of putting the well hand in their pocket and, as it were, almost forcing that hand, which is now paralyzed, to at least attempt to reach for objects, that through this practice, the neuroplasticity of the brain will begin to reconnect parts of the brain, not the damaged parts, but to rewire a way around the damaged parts of the brain. But you can imagine that this is enormously frustrating, because the patient is going to feel that the hand is broken and it won't move. But it's the intention, that word that you used, it's the intention of, I want to reach for that object with the hand that is not working, that gets the neuroplasticity. And there have been some remarkable studies where over a period of about a month of this, it must be excruciating work, but the persistence pays off in that often there's a recovery in that hand that was initially lost to the stroke. So Doidge, it's a very, very interesting book to look for.
Thank you. Fascinating. Thank you very much, Janine.
Patricia, you had a hand. You'll just need to unmute yourself.
Hello, I do have a question. I just want to stop the phone ringing, sorry. Fiona, can you take it in the other room? Can't take it here. Thank you. Sorry, you have been talking a lot, Jimmy, about the brain, and in a very interesting way. I want to ask whether you would distinguish between the brain and the soul or spirit, and would contemplation have more to do with the spirit and the soul than the brain, as opposed to insight, which I think would be more something in the brain?
Yes, so that is a wonderful question. So the idea from a contemporary philosophical position, the big debate would be between the mind and the brain. And so in philosophy, we have this puzzle, and it is an unanswered puzzle at this stage of what is the relationship between the mind and the brain, or the way it's more typically framed, the mind-body problem. And this is a particularly modern problem. It goes back 400 years to Descartes, who was the first to really explicitly highlight it in a very clear fashion. So the word soul is, depending on how you define it. And so to keep it simple, I would offer two different ways of defining soul. The one is the biblical view, which talks about, you know, you will love God with all your heart, with your mind, and with your soul, right? So there's a kind of a biblical sense of the soul, in which the soul is a kind of a life force, because you are to love God with your heart and your mind and your soul. So mind and soul are distinguished there. But then there's another view which identifies soul, the Greek word psyche for soul, with the mind, where mind and soul are the same. And so this is where models like Ken Wilber's are very useful, and also the Hindu notion, which we talked about last time, of the different bodies of gross, subtle, and causal, or gross, subtle, and very subtle, with the mind being understood as a very subtle energy or a very subtle type of body. I'm trying to give a simple explanation of a very complicated topic. So certainly the insight happens both at the level of the mind or the soul, as you put it, or even spirit, if we want to use that language. But, and this is what's so fascinating, but also at the level of the brain. In other words, what I'm finding so exciting about this research is the correlation between the body and the brain on the one hand, and mind or soul or spirit on the other, and how we can see the two happening at the same time. That at the moment of insight, if you can prompt it in just the right way, you can simultaneously measure exactly what is happening a few seconds before the aha moment through the EEG, and then at the moment, the exact moment of insight with the fMRI, at the same time as it's happening in the mind. Patricia, you have to unmute again. You'll have to unmute.
I have. I'm unmuted now. I wanted to say I like your answer. Thank you. I was
Thank you.
waiting to see what correlation you would make between the brain and the soul or spirit. And I think you've explained it as well as we can possibly explain it at the moment. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
very much. And it takes us back to St. Aquinas, right? That God speaks in the two languages, the two books. There's the book of scripture with ideas of soul and spirit. And then there's the book of nature, which we are understanding from our modern point of view as contemporary brain science. But the
Yes.
two languages are speaking to each
Yes.
other.
Yes. Thank you, Jimmy.
Thank you.
Jimmy, I found your tree of contemplation quite useful. It really opened up the concept of contemplation for me. For example, where you've had activism as a form of contemplation.
Yes.
So, I must, thank you for that. That was quite insightful.
Wonderful. Yeah. I remember when Professor Curry took us for the mysticism module all those years ago at St. Augustine's. She emphasized, and maybe Celia, you can comment on this, that the idea of the mystic as a solitary recluse, disconnected from the goings on in the world, is simply a bad stereotype. And we can look at St. Catherine of Siena, we can look at Meister Eckhart, we can look at St. Francis, we can look at, there are so many mystics who have been able to join both the solitary, mystical, reclusive dimension together with a very public and active life. And I think that's a spirituality to aspire to in our time with so much suffering that is happening in the world. Black Lives Matter just being the latest example, where as mystics, or aspiring mystics anyway, we hopefully have a contribution to make towards justice.
That's absolutely true, Jimmy. And, the older view of spirituality, we'd go and join the cloister or go up to the mountain or go into the cave because we felt we wanted to live a spiritual life. Whereas what you're saying is the spiritual life. Everyday life is the spiritual life. Just one little addition to that. For those of us who are sort of moving into our golden years, present company accepted, but some of us are moving more into our golden years. Well, Trish, I think you all understand what I'm trying to say here. There's the other side of it that we can't do as, or we're not now as involved in the activities of the world as we once were in our younger years, but our very daily life of prayer, and I don't mean by that, long periods of prayer, just being in prayer, living in prayer, is also a kind of spiritual activism, because if we are in that stage of prayer, it includes praying for the world, if you like to call it like that, including all these situations in which we find ourselves globally. For example, the COVID virus, it's not as though it's only active or contemplative, it's both in both stages of life. But at this stage of life, maybe Trisha's got a bit more insight as well there, and Francis also, in this stage of life, we're still active, but actually our contemplative life, if you like, is more apparent, or that's not the word I'm looking for, but it's both and. I don't know if anyone else would like to just, I think Trish and I have spoken about this. Trish hasn't got your sound on.
the balance changes. The contemplative side, as one gets older, and I will be 80 this year, the contemplative side takes more time and more of your attention, more of your life is spent in the contemplative side and less in the active. You just haven't got the energy for the active side so much, but you carry on both, but the balance does change. That's how I found it.
Francis, would you also perhaps, being a sister yourself, also still quite active, I know, with the sisters, but in your nursing days, you would have been very much more active. And now when we come to this stage of life, there's a tendency to think, oh, I'm not doing as much as I should be doing. What more should I be doing? But the very being in a different state of life allows us to still be active in a spiritual sense.
Yeah, well, for me, I felt it's important not to just keep on with the physical, like to look a little bit ahead and say, well, I'm not always going to be 30 and 40 and running around in the physical sense. So it's like your second journey or whatever. No, your second half of life. So you're more internal than external, more maybe introvert than extrovert. So that's active and the passive, contemplation and activity. So, for me it was important to think about not just nursing in the physical sense. I don't know if you can hear me. Yeah. So the contemplative comes more to the fore in the second half of life. So it's that, isn't it, that life transition that we go through in the middle years, spiritually and physically. Yeah.
It makes it quite an exciting time of life, actually.
Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah. If we can look
Jill, can I just ask you, sorry, forgive me if I'm just calling you out, but we've had a few chats along similar lines with respect to prayer and so on. I know, Jill, you're still very active. Do you see this time of life as being more contemplative or having more time, perhaps?
Who are you talking to, Celia?
Jill.
Oh, Jill.
I don't know if did Jill hear me? I'm not sure. Sorry.
Sorry. Yes, I can. You were talking to me, right?
I was. Sorry. I meant,
yes, no, fine. I wasn't quite sure if it was Francis or Jill. Now I find that even being in our golden years, I find I'm very busy. But I certainly think in prayer it changes a little. You can spend more time. I love spending time in nature. And I thought I was so delighted when I heard Jimmy say it's two avenues of getting to know God, the scripture and nature. And I hadn't really thought of that or been aware of that. Yeah, I think, and also praying for the world around us, because we can look so much more in our time, which we do have available. But somehow I'm still kept very busy. Yeah. And I think it's very important to have a love of life, which you well said. I think it is an exciting time if we allow it to be. And I love the idea of the neuroplasticity.
Yeah.
I'm going to start working much harder on that one. Thank you. Yeah. So yes, it is an exciting time. I guess we must make it so.
Yes, because when Jimmy spoke about the ongoing development of the brain coming with new ideas and new thoughts and so on, I find that, and it's exciting, and Jimmy used the word exciting. I find that exciting when we read stuff. We're always reading different things. And suddenly you just want to dance because something is so powerful, So I understand that very, very much. But also moving more towards the not being so actively involved, it's an exciting time of life. Or maybe I'm just trying to convince myself, Jimmy, that this is an exciting time of life. But I do really believe what you said there. And Jill, thanks. I know we've had these kind of chats in the past, especially when it comes to praying for people, or actually, as we've been speaking about before we went on to Zoom, holding people in prayer, holding people in the light, and praying in that sense. So I think we're privileged that we have more time at this stage of life. But at the same time, you know, I'm looking at Suzette here and also Elma, who are in the younger years. But nevertheless, the prayer doesn't mean that because you're in an active life, you're no longer in a contemplative life. So this union of contemplation and action, I think, is so important. Yeah, thank you.
So, any more comments or questions? It's been a wonderful discussion. Thank you all for your attention and participation. EJ?
You've given us so much to think about. Yeah, it would be great if you could share your PowerPoint with us in a PDF. That would really be great.
A pleasure. There's a lot of material there that I didn't get to, so that will also be in the slides. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Celia, still anything from your side?
Oh, I was just saying thank you, but it was to the atmosphere because I had my mute on. Sorry about that. Thank you so much. And I always feel with these presentations, we glean so much that we need to keep thinking about when we're going to ask you to come back and follow up on these various issues that we're looking at in the Zoom meetings. There's so much, it's so wonderful. But EJ, once again, thank you to you. I think your Zooming and technological proclivities and expertise is a very powerful form of prayer for all of us who are still to get it all right. But it really is helpful. And so thank you very much for all you've done and for doing the recording and sending it back and all the rest. And for those who are still with us, there's a number of interesting people coming up still. We'll look at the schedule and let you know. And slightly different emphasis each time. Suzette, I'm looking at you actually. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear me. But Suzette is in the Enneagram. Now, I should ask you privately instead of publicly, forgive me, but we might think of asking you to come and Zoom in one afternoon with us and share a little about the Enneagram. The interesting thing about all of these possibilities is the fact that we were going to have this anyway with our small mystic group. Do you remember, Suzette? Suzette, we were going to ask you to come. We're going to ask Jimmy to come. Elmo, I see you in the corner there. Yes, Elmo did come and talk about Merton, but now that you're researching contemplative leadership, sorry, I'm calling everyone out. That may not be the most professional thing to do, but there are so many exciting topics, so we will certainly continue. So, yeah. This is that if you get a message from us or from me or from EJ, Is it possible?
Yeah, that's, yes. No, it's my passion. I also love speaking about my passion. Like you, Jim, it was wonderful. I just sit at your feet and it's so wonderful to learn together. And I am very passionate about the Enneagram, so it will be a pleasure.
Wonderful. So each of you got another name for the list. That's wonderful. Thank you.
Can't wait.
So thank you, everyone. Each is our time up, I guess.
Thank you, everybody.
So we say bye-bye.
Bye.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Jimmy.
Bye.